So we were talking about types of funding agencies that are not government grants, or government offered or foundation offered. As we were talking about, the advice that we gave in terms of government grants or foundation grants will largely apply in sort of a mix to the different kinds of agencies, and even within a specific kind of group. For example, nonprofits or non-governmental organizations, some are going to have an outlook and a process that resembles more like what you'll see in grants offered by governments. Others are going to be more like the smaller or the foundations. And then the last thing that I was going to add in terms of looking at these kinds of these other kinds of funding agencies is some of these have just entered the grant making space recently, especially a lot of the corporations that are moving into corporate social responsibility and looking at ways that they can make an impact other than the product that they're selling. If you're working with an organization like that, or you may find that their application process is not standardized at all,
or possibly non-existent,
or non-existent, and funding from them may turn from doing an application process into more of a relationship cultivation process, where you're talking about a lot of the things that you would talk about in an application, but it has to be on a face-to-face basis over sort of a longer period of time. And it may fall into that category that we spoke about earlier of really places that you can get money, but they're not actually traditional grants. So there's a mix, and you'll have to do a little bit more work if you're looking at these agencies, to try and figure out where they fall on that spectrum.
Okay, we can talk a little bit about what to do when you're preparing to apply. The first thing we recommend you do is that you research the funder organization. We've talked at length about the different types of funder organizations and where you might want to look. Another good thing to do is, if you know anyone who has received a grant from this funder in the past, it can be hugely helpful to have a conversation with them about their experience. Many will be even willing to share their application with you, and that can be helpful because it was successful. It's a good idea to look at how big the typical award from this funder is, and be aware that this is not necessarily the same as the grant maximum. So it could be that they give grants up to $1 million, but their typical grant is more like in the $50,000 range. That's important to know, and you should shape your proposal accordingly. You definitely want to look at whether the granting organization accepts unsolicited proposals, if that is what you are thinking of doing. Assuming that there is a specific opportunity, you also want to research the specific opportunity that you're planning to respond to. One important thing to look at is whether you meet the eligibility guidelines. We can't recommend this enough. We feel terrible when we receive applications from ineligible applicants. They've put hours and hours of work into it, and their application isn't even going to be considered because they don't meet our guidelines. You also want to look at what types of activities can be supported with the grant funds. So often equipment is excluded or travel is excluded. So you want to make sure that those restrictions are a good fit with what you're proposing to do. And that the objectives outlined in the opportunity are also a good fit with what you would like to do. You want to make sure that you're aware of what the structure of the application is and what the process is for applying and reviewing. Do you need to submit a letter of intent or anything like that? Is there a specific format that you need to follow for the applications? You certainly want to be aware of the deadlines, and you want to know if this is sort of a one-time opportunity or the opportunity will be offered again, so that if you can't meet the upcoming deadline, perhaps you can meet a future one with more planning. You want to think about if they give you an idea of how many awards will be made from this opportunity and how competitive it will be. This information can help you decide whether it is worth your time to put the effort into applying. And finally, you want to look at what the review process will be. And you want to try to get a sense of what the reviewers are likely to be looking for, in addition to what the organization will be looking for. And maddeningly and confusingly, those two things are not always the same. So you want to make sure that what you write steers a course that will satisfy everyone involved in the process.
All right, so part of your grant preparation as well is getting the right people involved into this grant writing process. There's a lot of grants that rather than being offered on an individual basis, they're looking for collaborators. So you want to make sure that you have enough time to get all of these groups together. One of the important notes on applications that do require collaborations with others, sometimes there's specific designations of what kind of people can be collaborators. Particularly government-sponsored ones, they'll say, okay, we want a citizen of our country and a citizen of the co-hosting country of this grant. And the collaboration has to be between two researchers in those two specific contexts. Other times they're more open-ended. One thing that's really important to note here is if you don't have a collaborator, some of the funding agencies may actually be able to help you find an appropriate collaborator. They do this in different ways. Sometimes there's a listing of researchers that are kind of open to collaboration. Sometimes by speaking with them directly, they'll help you find people who might be appropriate collaborators, or you may just be on your own. But if you're looking at an opportunity that you feel like you have a good application for and you're looking for a collaborator, don't forget to use the funding agency if they're open to it. If they do specifically say that they're not going to help you find a collaborator, then don't ask though. In addition to collaborators, does your application itself require the support of others? Even if you're applying as an individual for a fellowship for yourself, you probably need letters of support. You may need other people at your institution to help. For example, if it's a big grant that's looking at the institutional financial records, then you have to get your finance office involved. If they ask questions about infrastructure, if there's any kind of environmental or building component, you might need to get some of your other institutional people to support you writing that section. Same with educational initiatives or mentors. So because getting this team together can take a lot of time, do pay attention to your timing. Try and get people involved as early as you can. A month is a pretty short timeline actually to be preparing for a grant. So keep that in mind.
Okay, another thing that Melissa and I thought we could offer some insight into, because we are grant managers and we deal with this all the time, is pre-application communication with funders. It is important for everyone to know that in general, grant managers like Melissa and myself are very busy people, very detail-oriented people. We are generally looking for capable, talented grantees who are self-motivated. And finally, it's important to remember that we are human. It may not seem like it sometimes, but there always is another person on the other end of the email. It's important to remember that even in cases where there is an external review process that largely determines your fate, it is very important to have the grant managers on your side. We can help you. We often control the screening process and can offer you a second chance or special hints if you've made a brief mistake in your application. Many organizations, we control the review process, including giving instructions to the reviewers. And at almost all organizations, we have the power to advocate on your behalf if we feel motivated to do so. And finally, we know exactly what's going on behind the scenes at the granting organization and can offer you valuable insights, guidance, feedback, hints. In our case, all you really have to do is ask us. But you'd be surprised at how many people don't. All that said, it is a bit of a double-edged sword to be communicating with the grant managers prior to submitting your application, because we do start to form impressions of you before the first time we meet you. So it can be very helpful to you to start a conversation prior to submission and to give us a chance to get to know you. But you also want to be careful not to make the wrong impression. And some tips for making the best possible impression. It's a good idea to ask specific, thoughtful questions and to provide enough relevant detail about your situation for us to give a meaningful answer. We often get asked questions like, am I eligible? And our response is, we don't know. What country are you from? Give us some more information. Exactly. So try to ask a question that is thoughtful and that we can answer. Always be polite, express appreciation if you're provided assistance, and avoid making demands. It's okay to tell us if you think we've made an error or you disagree, but try to be polite about it. It is very important to read all of the relevant information available to you. If there's a webinar or some kind of recorded question and answer session, watch or listen, and please don't ask us questions that we've already answered somewhere else. We don't like that very much.
Yeah. That's particularly tricky because, it can give a particularly bad impression because, as we said, we're looking for capable, talented, and self-motivated people. If you haven't been self-motivated to look at the materials that we've already provided to you, then that's basically what asking us something that we've already answered gives us the impression that you don't have that motivation to do that. So really take a look at all the available materials and try to understand them as best you can.
Another tip is to review your message before sending it. Please try to check for typos, abbreviations, text speak, punctuation. If English is not your first language, we certainly make allowances for that, but we do appreciate proofreading. One thing that makes us absolutely crazy is when we receive emails that are in all caps. That's shouting, and we don't like it very much. And finally, this is perhaps the most difficult tip, but you should try to match your level of formality to the person that you're corresponding with. So if the responses you receive seem conversational, it can be very helpful to engage in conversation and to let a little bit of your personality show. That tends to make a good impression. But that's difficult to navigate, and you don't want to take it too far. And finally, don't give us a reason to ignore your message. Don't ever send us unsolicited attachments, including proposals. We assume that any email from someone we don't know that contains an attachment is an email virus, and we do not open it. Try to write as clearly and succinctly as possible and in the language preferred by the funding organization. And finally, writing via email is usually better than calling in most cases. We're often not available to take a phone call, or it's a bad time, and email is just much easier and more convenient for us to respond to. And we know this isn't the case with all funding agencies, but we do answer our emails, or we do our very best to.
One thing that I just realized we forgot to note on here is if you are sending an email, and you have an institutional email address versus a personal email address, it's usually better to write to us from the institutional address It gives a little bit more credence to, you know, where the email is coming from. It's someone who's affiliated with a research institution, as opposed to, for example, a Yahoo email address. If you don't trust your institution, a lot of institutional email servers aren't the most reliable. So if you don't trust that your institution email service is going to be able to send and receive messages in a timely manner, well, what I would do is CC your institutional email address at least, so that we can see that there's a known institution behind whoever the applicant is. And a lot of agencies, particularly in the US, will kind of look at that. We won't necessarily ignore emails coming not from an institution, but we may have a little bit more pause before reading it. All right, so some other tips on actually writing the application itself. When you sit down, you've got your list of questions in front of you. Make sure that you answer all the required questions and provide all the requested information. You'll often see this in grant applications, that there's a main question and then a bunch of sub-questions under it, or a bunch of points or examples of things that they want you to answer. Take those instructions very seriously. Remember that you're competing against other people. So someone who's answering all the subparts and has a good justification for all of these things is in a much better position than someone who's only answered some of it. If an item is clearly marked as optional, unless an item is clearly marked as optional, provide all the information. If you have a question where it says answer is optional, do be careful with that. If you have a good answer to the optional question, typically it's good to answer that question. But if you have a weak answer, you know, it's something that you can't really speak to, then answering it, that'll pretty much show up, and that can cast doubt on your entire application. So with optional questions, for the most part, you know, a strong answer in the optional question is going to be good. A weak answer, you want to think about, is it worth it to put in a weaker answer? As much as possible, include relevant details and add concrete examples. The applications that we look at, I mean, we often even categorize it as, you know, this is in category A, they're addressing these kinds of things. Category B, they're addressing these kinds of things. The applications can be very similar to each other. So to make yours stand out, it's really in the details. So provide as many as possible. Again, do this with a grain of salt. You want your details to be relevant. An example from our application, we asked for you to provide some basic research concepts about the application, but we don't want the same thing as a technical research proposal. We specifically don't give you enough space to put in a technical research proposal, and we from our application don't want to see take 5 mils of this and put it into that solution. We're looking for a broader concept. So the details that you provide need to be the details that we're looking for. And as we talked about the priorities and those kinds of things, try to take a look at that when you're trying to figure out what details to put in. Again, remember who your audience is. That can be largely based on funder type. And throughout, the application is supposed to be a single application. So throughout, you should be telling a consistent, compelling story. And this is the case whether it's a technical, you know, a very technical centered application, it's more of a storytelling application, whatever kind of application it is, You need to have a consistent, compelling story. It can be hard to do that. You have to strike a balance between telling the funder what they want to hear, remaining credible, you know what you're talking about, and doing justice to what your actual proposal is. If you're stretching just to completely tell them what you think they want to hear, that'll probably come out. Remember, each piece is really supposed to be supporting the other pieces. So another example from our application specifically is, you know, we ask for equipment needs and we ask for projects that are using the equipment. Your list of equipment needs should match your description of what you're using the equipment for. All of these pieces should be coming together into one story. And then lastly, tailor your language, formality, and style to what you know about the funder. And remember that, again, you're trying to balance the funder and any external reviewers that you may have. All right, just a few more things on writing the grant. Always have a colleague review your application, particularly if you're writing in a second language. Follow all the submission guidelines exactly to the letter, regardless of whether you're doing a government grant or a foundation or other kind of grant opportunity. If they specified file formats, fonts, page numbers, make sure that you follow those. If they specify naming conventions, do it exactly as they say. They say a period here and a hyphen there, do a period here and a hyphen there. And don't submit anything the grantor hasn't asked for. You may have a great proposal for something that you think is related to the application, and you're having trouble fitting it in. Don't just submit it. If you're having trouble fitting it in, it's because the grantor doesn't want to see it. So please don't submit anything the grantor hasn't asked for. They're probably not going to read it. If you have any questions, contact the host organization. It's much better to try and get your question answered than to guess and to guess incorrectly. And then make sure that you submit your application on time. If you have technical difficulties or an emergency, you may be able to write the granting agency, explain it, and get an extension. But do your best to account for potential technical problems and submit your application, you know, before the deadline.
Okay, we have a few tips if an interview or a presentation is a part of the funding agency's process, as it is with ours. While scheduling an interview, please try to be as flexible as possible and provide multiple options if they ask you to suggest a time. When we do this, we're typically attempting to schedule 30 interviews all at once over the whole world's time zones, and it's very difficult for us, so we appreciate flexibility. Another tip is, assuming that the interview is remote, double and triple check the time zones and make sure you communicate the time zone that you're suggesting in both your local time and the grant agency's time zone. Melissa and I religiously triple check everything, and we still sometimes make mistakes. So it's very important to be clear about time zones. And during the interview, again, remember who you're speaking to and tailor your everything about what you say and how you say it to who the funder is. Do try to take cues from the interviewer about the appropriate level of formality. But never forget that this is an interview and you are trying to impress. So don't get sucked into so much conversation that you forget to hit on the points that you're trying to make. Possibly the most important tip I can give you about interviewing is to be honest and forthcoming, especially about potential difficulties. This is really the single most important thing we look for when we do interviews. We want to get the feeling that the person we're speaking to is trustworthy. And if we don't get that feeling, it typically goes to the bottom of our pile. So definitely it's always you want to present yourself in the best light, but you want to tell the truth and tell the whole truth, and that will almost certainly be appreciated by your interviewer. And finally, if there is a language barrier or technical difficulties during an interview, just be patient and persistent. We've asked to speak with you, and we really do want to hear what you have to say.
All right, so after you submit the application, what happens? The grant process doesn't end there. If you don't get the grant, there's a couple options that you have open to you. Definitely ask politely for feedback. A lot of agencies will give you feedback. They may be doing it on a specific timeline, so if they say, okay, we'll give you feedback on this timeline, please respect that, but don't be afraid to ask for feedback. Particularly if an agency is giving you feedback, they may be expecting you to use that feedback to reapply, and providing the feedback so that you can have a more successful grant on the second or third time around. So definitely try again. A lot of these grants are very, very competitive as well, and it may be a competitive grant one year, and maybe with a different portfolio, your particular grant is more competitive a different year. So, apply again. And definitely sign up for the funders mailing list so you can hear about new opportunities coming from them, so that you have, you can set up your time and your collaborators and get your next application in line. If you do get the grant, congratulations. Please acknowledge it immediately and express gratitude. Grantors want to know that you're going to be responsive, and that's the first opportunity. Well, it could be the first opportunity to see that. Always be prompt and courteous. Remember that it's still to your benefit to continue to make a good impression. Grant agencies can give you new grants. We can also help connect you to other people, provide recommendations. So always give a good impression. Comply with all the reporting requirements. The third slide in our presentation was all about the impact that our program has had. We can't provide that information without our grantees submitting reporting to us. And if we don't get that reporting, that actually affects our sustainability. So we do not look well upon groups that don't comply with our reporting requirements. Related to that, if you want to report successes outside of your reporting schedule, we love to see that. Again, it really drives our programs, it drives our funding to show that we're having success with funding. So we want to see that.
All right, and finally, just to get you started, we compiled a short list of currently open grant opportunities. The list starts with our Instrumental Access Program. We are currently accepting applications, and we encourage all of you who are at eligible institutions to apply. The list also contains the Pew Charitable Trust Latin American Fellows Program. This provides support for young scientists in Latin America to do postdoctoral training in the US. The SanBio Biofisa 2 Program Mobility Grants. The SanBio is a Southern African regional biotech organization. They're providing support for fellowships for up to 3 months to travel to a member organization. The Arturo Falaci ICGEB fellowships provide support for PhD and postdoctoral fellowships in biotechnology in member states. And finally, an organization called Idea Wild is offering small equipment grants for biodiversity conservation projects. So if any of those appeal, please check them out.
So that is pretty much all the things that we had planned for presenting, and we're running up on an hour. We want to remind you that these slides will be available. I think you're going to get a link after the webinar is over, and at the end of our slides that'll be posted, you'll see the links to all the different resources that we provided, including articles from AJE's Resource Center. And I think now is a good time to actually open up the webinar to questions from audience members, and maybe if you guys have some tips to share as well, I think that would be a really nice thing to share with the group that we've got here.
That sounds awesome. So thank you, Melissa and Christina. Thank you guys so much for sharing that information, sharing your experience and your tips, especially since you guys review and facilitate grants. And I just wanted to ask you, I think we talked about this a little bit previously. Does it still work for you guys? Would you like for me to facilitate and kind of go through those questions, or
yeah, that would be great. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. Well, we have it. So thank you, everyone. I see where you have added questions and where you're continuing to add questions. So if you have anything that you would like answered, feel free to put it in. We will answer as many of these as we can. So we may not be able to answer everyone's, but I'll go ahead and jump in. And so one of the questions is actually about, this person said, last year I applied for Seating Access 2017, but did not make it to the finish line. This year I am moving to a new position in a new university in another country. Can I put in for Access 2018 at my new institution?
Absolutely, as long as your new institution is supportive of it, by all means.
Mm-hmm. And as long as you continue to fulfill the eligibility guidelines. So the new institution for our instrumental access grant specifically needs to be a university, a research institution affiliated with a university, or a government lab. So basically not private research labs, clinics, hospitals, etc.
Perfect.
But this is a good opportunity to strike up a conversation with us. So by all means, email us and let us know your situation and that you're planning to reapply.
Yeah, and for those of you who are interested in contacting us specifically, either on, you know, if we don't have time to answer all the questions about grants broadly, or you have questions about instrumental acts and seating labs specifically, in the webinar slides, we've included a link to contact us at application@seatinglabs.org. And Christina and I both have access to that, and we're pretty much the ones who are answering the questions from there. So please feel free to use that. And I'll type that in the chat here as well.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. So yes, another question that we've received, this person says, is there a template to writing a strong grant proposal? So are there any templates that you might suggest or recommend in doing that?
I would say it's actually a bad idea to use a template because there are so many different priorities and expectations in writing that different agencies have. It's really hard to have a template that can fit basically any application. Really the best thing that you can do in terms of template is if you can get in contact with someone who has gotten an award from the specific agency that you're looking at and getting a hold of their grant application, that would be sort of the best template to go by. But I wouldn't go and download, you know, like put research objective here, put XYZ there, because it's not going to be catered to what that agency is looking for. And they really want to see that you're catering to them.
But what is a good idea, instead of a template, just having stock paragraphs or sections that you can slot in and then customize for each grant application is very helpful. And we always have, you know, paragraphs describing what we do and what we're good at and what our specific proposal is. You know, and then for a research proposal, there, you know, you're going to have your methodology paragraphs and all that. So you should be able to slot those into any agency's format and then customize them from there.
Yeah, but the important part really, if you're doing that, is the customization. So even with, you know, it may be customizing the language, the words that you're using, the length, You may have a longer thing that you want to cut down, but make sure you do that customization.
Awesome. Awesome. That's great. Thank you. Another question that we've received, this person says, I was wondering what sort of international grant organizations would support basic research from developing countries such as Mexico. Sometimes proposals have to be innovative and unique, but unfortunately, not all countries and labs have the infrastructure to develop leading research. So that is a big disadvantage to many countries. Any thoughts?
Well, in Mexico specifically, the government agencies do offer different kinds of grants. Although it is hard to be competitive if you're in a less resource institution within Mexico competing against a researcher at a more research institution. Certainly it may be hard to compete. From our mailing list specifically, which I would recommend that you sign up for, we publicize different grant opportunities that are mostly catered to researchers in developing countries. And so you can find some opportunities there. For basic research, it may depend a little bit on how well you can meet different kind of funding priorities. So a lot of foundations will offer grants, to researchers from different countries, but they may have a specific sort of area like health, for example. So how basic exactly is your basic research? Can you frame it in such a way that it meets some funders' priority for, health, for example, if you're doing microbiology? So it does depend a little bit on the research, but I think that's about it. I think TWAS is a good organization to look at, and Author Aid is another good organization to look at. And we included links to those organizations in the slide deck.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you. Do you think we have time for about 2 other questions?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, perfect. So one is there any difference between a project proposal and a business plan?
Oh, yes. A big difference. Yeah. I'm not an expert in business plans.
Well, for one thing, a business proposal is going to be looking at budget in different ways. For a business proposal, you are proposing a business, so you want to see that there's some way to make money. From a research proposal, you don't have to make money off of it. You just have to say what you're doing is incredibly interesting and exciting and perhaps will help advance, human life. So that's one big difference. Another big difference is for a business proposal, depending on what stage you're at, it's likely a little bit more concept-like than research proposal-like. So for a research proposal, you need to demonstrate that you really know what you're doing in terms of the research. The methodology has been established, or if not, you have a good reason to think that your methodology is going to work. You might have some preliminary research to show that, and you have to go through that, and you have to talk about why you're qualified to be doing this research. In a concept note, you do want to talk about all of that as well, but in a much shorter format, like a mini paragraph for each. Usually people who are evaluating business proposals don't have a lot of time, so they're not going to want to read past a few pages. So really condensing everything you've got and focusing on really what your business model is a difference.
Awesome. Awesome, great, thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. And then the last question, you know, that we'll have, and then we can wrap up, is in writing a research grant proposal, what is expected of me when required to write a biography or profile, not a CV, teaching philosophy, and research philosophy statements?
No, that's a different person.
Well, what is required from you in a bio will vary by funder. There's usually guidelines. A lot of government programs have very specific guidelines you have to follow. But more or less, it's a personal narrative. It's usually fairly short, but rather than sort of listing qualifications in CV form, you're going to tell them as a story. You have an opportunity to emphasize for the reader the things that you most want to emphasize, usually. You know, sometimes it's more formulaic than that, and they tell you exactly what to put in each paragraph. But you have a little bit more scope to sort of shape the narrative the way you want it shaped.
That being said, your biography is not your whole life story and everything.
Yes.
It's not your hobbies and what you like to do. It's what are your research qualifications and why have you taken this path in your research career, specifically for your research. For teaching philosophy, I would take a look at that. You can probably find some guidance and templates on. What they're looking for is there's specific pedagogical methodologies that people use in teaching. You know, lecture style versus, you know, the Socratic method. When you're teaching, what is your thought process and how to be an effective teacher? That's what the teaching philosophy is. Similarly, your research philosophy is the same thing, but for research. I haven't seen as much of a request for research philosophy as teaching philosophy. So I can't, I can't really speak to research philosophy, but for the teaching philosophy, that's really what they're looking for. What do you think you need to do to be an effective teacher?
Awesome. Awesome. Okay. Well, well, thank you ladies so much, both for presenting today and sharing